This is the next video in our series about developing a little mini web framework. In this particular video we're going to pick up from where we were in the previous one, but we're going to focus specifically on HTML and the various issues around HTML. We're going to produce a little HTML5 example and we're going to use the wi3 checker to check it. So last time we were looking at the different versions of HTML, noting that we had HTML versions 1 to 4. We then went to XHTML, which has been with us for quite a little while, and how we have now got to HTML5. And we were noting that HTML5 has actually introduced a really nice semantic clarity that is quite important to us. Before we get too far into looking specifically at HTML, we're going to just start with thinking about a fundamental rule that applies within the area of web browsers. So first of all, a fundamental rule says that we should be really strict about markup. When we're writing HTML pages, it's important to get the code exactly right. There are several reasons for this. For example, it helps to ensure browser compatibility. When we get little minor mistakes in our HTML, these mistakes tend to be picked up differently by different browsers, and we'll have quirky errors that we won't understand where they've come from. It also makes our code easier to maintain if we're OCD really about making sure that our code is exactly right, and it also helps us to avoid bugs in our coding. Besides being strict with markup, the fundamental rule dictates that a browser should be forgiving in interpretation. It's important that any web browser we have should make sure that it glosses over errors in HTML syntax, because it helps to ensure backwards compatibility for one thing. It also helps developers to get their web pages right. If it just says, oh, there's a mistake here, I'm not going to display anything, it's really unhelpful. And it also helps the user to see the website even if the website isn't particularly well coded. That's important because of the nature of the web where we have user contributed content. We mentioned last time that XHTML has been around with us for quite a while, and it was an interesting experience. It was very fussy about syntax, and when you took an XHTML page and put it through the wi3 checker, it tended to give many errors. It was quite scary, but it was actually helpful if you knew how to handle it. You needed to not panic when your page goes through the checker and gives, say, 149 errors. The trick was to learn to spot the root cause or causes, and you would find immediately that 142 consequent errors would disappear. It's surprising how many infuriating display quirks are caused by minor syntactical errors. So it's quite important to get your syntax exactly right. Now, we've had HTML5 has been introduced recently, and one could raise the question of when is the right time to change. It's nice to be at the head of the game, moving before anyone else, but you need to be sensible about that and remember that not everyone will have browsers that understand HTML5. So the issues could be summarised as follows, I suppose: that XHTML works in all modern browsers. There is no current browser that fully implements HTML5 yet. However, the important HTML5 features work in the main modern browsers. HTML5 is increasingly supported and will be the standard when you graduate. It's also a significant step forward compared with previous incremental changes. It's brilliant having the semantic structures available to you. It's also an easy fix to make HTML5 work in earlier browsers. It's even possible to add a fix so it works in legacy IE. That's the big challenge, and you can do it. So what we're going to do is focus on HTML5 in these videos. So here's the structure of a very basic HTML5 page. It needs a doc type declaration right at the start. Then you have the HTML document that follows, included in the HTML diamond brackets and /HTML markups. And then you have a head section and a body section. Within the head section there's different things that will go in there, but for now the obvious one is the title/title, which is the bit that comes up in the little tab at the top of your web browser, not actually in the web browser space itself. The head section contains all the information you might need about the document, if you like, the meta section with all the information about it. The body section contains the actual content of the document. Now, we might be tempted to ask the question, HTML5 seems to offer quite a lot, so what new features can I try? I'd suggest that that's maybe the wrong question. Why? Well, just because you can doesn't mean to say you should. On this slide here we've got an example from the webcomic XKCD. It was a tribute on XKCD when Yahoo GeoCities finally closed down. GeoCities would be before your time, but basically in the early days Yahoo offered this space where you could just build web pages. Anybody could go on and build web pages. It was the early days of the web, and folk had lots of fun putting in all sorts of stuff. It was the days when we put things like under construction on our websites. We had little graphics with workmen digging things. We had blinking text. We had really poor icons that didn't match and that didn't fit together, and we had lots of tables and we had frames and all sorts of things that were utterly dire. They looked terrible, they drove you mad, and people used to complain bitterly about them. But they were features that were there, so we had to find a use for them. Okay, so in answer to the question, what new features can I try? It probably is sensible to say, yes, this is the wrong question. It's okay to find out what HTML5 can do, but don't do things just because you can. For the sake of this example, we only want to consider a little website of a handful of pages and relatively straightforward content, just for the sake of example. So the next question that then comes to my mind is to think, well, so I can get my head around this, I really want to think about how am I going to lay this content out. Well, there are a number of ideas that exist, but quite a lot of them, come to something like the diagram here. So you'll have some sort of header section, then you'll have a main page area which might have a left and a right section either side of it, and you'll have a footer section. You can see this in all sorts of examples, and it varies a little bit, but this is typically the sort of thing that you've got very often. So maybe the left section becomes, in old school websites, might become the menu, and it might stretch right to the top of the visible web page and right to the bottom, so that the header, main page area and footer are all to the right of that. Very often we have the navigation section, which is actually within the header, if you like, and the main page area is, if in a simple website, is all there is, so that you might have a left and a right, but they're just borders rather than anything else. But that's the sort of general idea that you can have to start with. So basically, for a modern website, we might have something that looks perhaps more like this diagram, where we have a header. Beneath that we have a navigation section. Then we have a main section where we put our main stuff. We might have a separate article. We might have an aside, something that's talking about what's in the main section, perhaps, or the article. And we might have a footer, so it's not a huge difference from the previous one, but it's quite nice. Moving on from this, we then can say, oh look, this is amazing because this layout is supported by HTML5. So we've got our doc type HTML as we had before, and the headers we had before. Don't get confused, of course, with the head section and the header section. The header is talking about content. The head section in HTML is talking about the meta information about the document. So within our body we've got a header, as we had in our diagram, a nav section where we put our menu. We have a section maybe with the main page content, and a footer section. Notice we're keeping it really simple, so we haven't got an aside here. Isn't this amazing? Whoa, but just hold on a moment. We've just fallen into the trap that many people fall into. We have confused physical layout with semantic structure. In our HTML5, we're defining semantic structure. We're defining the role that each of these sections of our code will play. We should not confuse this with the physical page layout that we want. The layout will be handled by our CSS, not by the HTML, so we need to be careful about that. It is a little bit tricky because there is a little bit of interplay, and we'll see that we get a little bit stuck in one way in a little further on. But for now, let's think about the fact that we really don't want to confuse our semantic structure with our physical structure. So now going back to our HTML5 definitions, it's a good thing before we move on to remind ourselves that actually what this is about is not defining what something will look like when we look at our header section or our nav section or our section or our aside section or our footer section. What we are doing is defining the semantic role of the content that goes in each of those sections, and it's there for a very specific reason, so that search engines like Google can look at our web page and easily decide, oh look, this bit of text here is the header, this bit of text here is the navigation, this bit of text does, and so on and so forth. So it then can make a better decision about how to present our web page in the search engine results. That's really important, because if we want to present well in search engines, we'd better link on into this idea of semantic structure and defining our content semantically for the search engines. So with that in mind, let's now look at our example HTML5 document. So here we are with our doc type defined as HTML. That means it's HTML5 when it's defined like that. We've got a head section defined with just a title in there for the tab up the top of the web browser, and then the actual page content defined underneath with a header, a navigation section with just 2 pages, a section which contains the main content of the page, and a footer section. If we define all of that and then display it in our browser, okay, it doesn't look very wonderful at all. But hold on a moment, we need to remember that we're thinking about separation of concerns. So the content of the page is fine, or at least there's virtually no content in there, but if we fill it up with the content we want, the content will be fine. What we're complaining about is that the presentation is ridiculous. But what we're saying is the presentation should all be handled by the CSS. We're going to look at that in the next slot. What we have achieved is we've managed to separate out the presentation from the content and the semantic structure of the page. So before we finish, we should check our handiwork. We should put our HTML5 code into the W3 checker, which we can find at this address here, and we discover, oops, there's a problem. What is it? Well, it's simple enough. We've missed out a little bit that HTML5 demands, which is that there should be a little bit of metadata in the head section that tells the browser what the char set is, what character encoding we're using. In practice, it's not a big deal, because the browser will make assumptions that will display virtually anything you can think of just fine. But in order to get it through the checker, we better put that in, and as soon as we insert that into our code, hey presto, it all validates fine. One last thing that I need to mention, partly because I think you may need this in the workshop, is don't forget that Chrome's developer tools are your friends. Actually, most modern browsers provide developer tools, so you can find them in Internet Explorer and Firefox, but I think generally as a team we like Chrome's developer tools best. They seem to be the most helpful. There are some things like Firefox has a really nice little section where it says this is what your page will look like in a mobile at different resolutions. That's quite nice. And Internet Explorer, there is nothing else you can use other than Internet Explorer if you really want to check out what your website will look like in a legacy Internet Explorer browser. That's quite nicely done in Internet Explorer. But generally, as I say, we quite like the Chrome developer tools. They'll be on F12 or the drop-down menu, and you'll find that there are different things you can look at. For the labs, I think you will probably want to get the developer tools up with the JavaScript console, but there are other things. It tells you how the page is loading over the network and the different processes it's going through in doing that. And the thing that I use personally quite a lot is the first bit, the resources thing, I think it's called, the tab on the developer tools, which allows you to pick out particular sections of your page and then look at the styling that's applied to it and where it's come from. So when we do CSS, that will be really, really helpful to see when you change the CSS and it doesn't do what you think it does. Use your developer tools and it will say, yeah, you might have changed that there, but it's overridden by something else somewhere else, and it will tell you where it's all coming from. It's really good. That's enough for this time, so in the next video we'll take a look at CSS in some detail.